Hello and welcome to SRIRAM's IAS, Teaching and Coaching Center for Young Adults who aspire to be civil servants. I'm Paranjoy Guha Thakurta, and with me I have Mahesh Vyas. Mr. Vyas is the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of CMIE, that is the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy. CMIE, Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, is a private organization that does a lot. What it claims is that it provides the largest, fastest, and technologically most advanced household surveys. Mr. Vyas has been in this position for more than 20 years. He's a regular columnist for Business Standard, and he has over these last 20 years strategized the transition of the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy from a private think tank to a database company to an organization that provides database-oriented solutions to various businesses and organizations. And from just merely estimating market shares and industry structures, the CMIE today does a lot of surveys on broad macroeconomic themes, from measuring poverty. Incidentally, the methodology used by the CMIE was included in Dr. C. Rangarajan's, the committee headed by Dr. C. Rangarajan, its report on poverty, which was presented in 2014. And today we're going to focus on employment and unemployment, which is one area which the CMIE has been quite focused on. And before I finish my introduction to Mr. Mahesh Vyas, I should say he's also an independent director of Centurion Bank, also Geojit BNP Paribas Financial Services, Quantum Asset Management Company. And he's been a member of various government committees. So thank you once again, Mr. Mahesh Vyas, for giving us your time. So let me first ask you a very general question on how do you measure unemployment? And then if you could elaborate a little bit on how serious is the unemployment crisis at present? I mean, especially after the pandemic and the economic lockdown.
Thank you, Paranjoy. And first, I would like to say that it's a great pleasure for me to be on this show with you. I'm delighted to speak tomorrow with young, bright administrators of the country. So this is my great pleasure. Let me place on record a great appreciation and honor in addressing them. Now, on your question on how do we measure unemployment in the country? So, there are two broad ways in which you can measure outcomes in the labor markets. One is that you ask households regarding their labor participation. And the second is you can ask enterprises how many people are they employing. And through that method, you can also use an administrative database which says, what is the payroll structure telling us? Now, an enterprise survey or the payroll method of estimating employment, it cannot estimate unemployment, is useful in a country where most of the enterprises are organized and their paychecks are made through a centralized payroll system. This is not the case in India. In India, most of the enterprises are informal, unorganized, and their wage payments are not done through a formal payroll system.
So if I can just throw in some figures, various estimates have come. It is said that roughly 90% of those who are working in this country, of our total labor force, is in the so-called unorganized or informal sector. And they are very important because they contribute roughly half of India's gross domestic product. Please continue.
Job, which is in either the government or in the large organized private sector that ensures that you do get gratuity benefits, you do get provident fund, you do get paid leaves, and you do have some securities that a large organization can offer you and a small unorganized sector cannot offer you. Labor productivity in the unorganized sector is extremely poor, and the kind of jobs they offer are also very poor. But this is the situation we are in right now. And given this, it is not possible for India to generate enough labor statistics from the enterprises to make sense. But we can do a household survey, which is the other way in which you get labor statistics. And India has traditionally been doing household surveys. The government's National Statistical Organization, of which the National Sample Survey Organization has been a part for a very long time. The NSSO was entrusted with the task of conducting household surveys or field surveys on a regular basis. Now, one of the surveys that the NSSO has been doing is a survey for employment and employment status. This, the last that we know of the NSSO's labor survey, has a sample size of about 105,000 households. So 105,000 is where their sample size rests. This has been constant for a fairly long time. In 2014, CMI started conducting a household survey as well, large all India representative. It is what we call in statistics a multi-stage stratified sampling methodology. So you cut up the country into multiple regions so that you don't miss out anything. And from each of them, you pick a sample by further stratification. Rural and urban are separate, and towns are again broken up into different sizes of towns. Once you have done the stratification, then you pick a sample through what is called as the simple random sampling methodology. Then you have got a largely representative sample from which we can draw inferences which will tell you the situation for the country as a whole. So India has of the order of 300 million households, and the NSO has a sample of 100,000 households. 300 million, 100,000. But since that 100,000 is also multi-stage stratified sampling, it is representative of the country as a whole. Now, CMI has done exactly the same thing, multi-stage stratified sampling methodology, which is all representative, but we've gone one step ahead. We have increased the sample size to 175,000 households. So our sample size is about 65% higher than what the official statistics is. Now, the NSSO conducts its survey once in 5 years. And in the recent times, they have started doing what is called as the Periodic Labor Force Survey, the PLFS. The PLFS has been designed to do the survey every year, and also for urban India every quarter. Now, this is a great step compared to once in 5 years, that we are now going to get data on a yearly basis, and for urban India on a quarterly basis. They have got some teething problems in getting this machinery still flying, but I think they're moving in the right direction.
Okay.
What we have done is we have a larger sample, and instead of conducting a survey every year, we are conducting the survey thrice in a year.
All right.
So we do 3 comprehensive surveys.
So I'm going to ask you a few more questions about the methodology, the sampling techniques, and those who, I'm also going to ask you to respond to those who are critical also of and who believe there are certain limitations in the manner in which the CMI does its surveys. But before I do that, I go back to the question I asked you. According to the data that you have, the CMI has, how did the situation change after the countrywide lockdown? You see, when we had spoken and what you've written, the lockdown started on the midnight of the 24th and early morning of the 25th of March. And you have argued that in April, the unemployment level went to a record high. And it was somewhere in the region of 1 out of 4 Indians were without a job. And then subsequently, the situation picked up and improved. Would you like to give us the details about what the CMI data reveals of the impact of the lockdown on employment?
The impact of the lockdown lockdown on employment was immediate and was severe. So, like you pointed out, that the survey, that the lockdown came into effect on the midnight between 24th and 25th. We see that in the last week of March, the unemployment rate shot up to 23.5%. And it was 7.8% before that. So we had a 7.5% order of magnitude unemployment rate in the country. For 2019-20 as a whole also, we have around 7.7% unemployment rate. Now this immediately shoots up sharply to 23.5%. We were effective in ensuring that the survey execution continued through the lockdown as well. So we have made measurements even when there was a lockdown. Now, in the first week of April, again, it was 24%. And it remained at 24% in the month of April as a whole and in the month of May as well. If we look at the weekly data, then somewhere towards the middle or the third week of April, we saw this reach to 29%. So the unemployment rate, which was around 7.5%, shot up to 24% and even touched 29%. But this is not the entire story of the misery that the labor markets faced. Because there's a second indicator which is equally important and oftentimes more important than the unemployment rate, which is the labor participation rate. The labor participation.
Explain what is the labor participation rate.
So first, let me explain what is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is the ratio of those people who are looking for jobs, who are willing to work, looking for jobs and not finding them. So it is necessary for you to actively look for a job. If you're sitting at home and not looking for a job, then you're not called unemployed. You're called out of the labor force. You have to be actively looking for a job and still not find it, you will be called unemployed. The unemployment rate is this unemployed section of the society as a percentage of the labor force. So the labor force is the denominator. Now, what is the labor force? The labor force is the sum of all the people who are employed and all the people who are, as I described earlier, unemployed. So you take all the people who are employed and all the people who are unemployed, you get what is the labor force. These are the people who are willing to work. And of them, some people have got jobs, some people don't have jobs. The ratio of those who don't have jobs to the total number of labor employed and unemployed is the unemployment rate. Now, the labor force declined along with an increase in the unemployment rate during the lockdown. So let me take this slowly. We have seen that the unemployment rate shot up from around 7.5% to 24%.
And also for a brief while to 29%.
Yes. But simultaneously, the labor participation rate, which is the number of people who are willing to work as a percentage of the total population. And when we talk of labor statistics, we are always talking of people who are more than 15 years of age. Sorry, 15 or more than 15 years of age. Otherwise, they're not counted. So now, the labor participation rate is the number of employed and unemployed people as a percentage of the total population above 15. Now, this ratio used to be in the vicinity of 50% for India. After demonetization, this dropped to around 45%, was down to around 43% before the lockdown, fell to 35%. So, a large number of people left the labor market. And of those that were remaining, mind you, of those that were remaining, a lower number that was remaining, even from that smaller number, 24% was still unemployed.
So that is a matter of concern and I would say even alarm, that even as the labor force shrank effectively, the number of people who wanted jobs, who were looking for jobs but did not get it, shot up. Yes.
That's right. That's right. So this is in a sense alarming, but also it gives you an idea of the effect of the lockdown. If you shut down the economy, if the people in the country are mostly informally employed in the unorganized sector, then you are going to get such a high unemployment rate because all those people do not have places to go to work. But suppose the country was organized. Suppose all of us were working for either the government or Infosys or Tata's, then we would continue to get a salary, continue to get a pay cut and continue to get a salary, but we would not get easily unemployed. People who have vulnerable jobs, and if the structure of the economy is such that it keeps most of the people in unorganized sectors with very informal arrangements to work, then you will see this very high increase in unemployment. So we had a severe problem of high unemployment in the face of a fall in the labor participation rate.
All right. I'm going to ask you more questions on the migration that took place. But before I ask you those questions, I want you to comment a little bit about the government and how the government of India gathers statistics, and especially statistics pertaining to labor and employment. And you already touched upon this, but I'd like you to explain. We've seen different ministries. We have the labor ministry, labor, and it's also got a longer name now, but there is a body called the Labor Bureau, which is based in Shimla. And then we have the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, under which comes bodies like the Central Statistics Office and the NSSO, the National Sample Survey Organization. Now, you've talked about how the PLFS, the Periodic Labor Force Survey, how it has changed over the years. But recently, if you will recall, a little more, about a year and a half ago, there was a huge controversy when the last survey of the last report of the Periodic Labor Force Survey was released, or let me put it this way, was prepared in early, or should I say late 2018 or early 2019, sometime around then, a copy of that report was ready, but the government did not release it. And this led to two members of the National Statistical Commission, two government statisticians putting in their papers in protest. They resigned. And then this report was leaked to Business Standard newspaper, and it showed that the unemployment rate as measured by the Periodic Labor Force Survey was the highest in 45 years. That means sometime in the early 70s, because these figures pertain to 2018-19 or 2017-18. You may correct me if I'm wrong. And the interesting part of the story, at that time, government spokesperson said, no, this is incomplete work. This is work in progress. It's not over. And then after the elections were over, that same report was released. And if we were comparing then apples with oranges and now oranges with apples, the figures were more or less the same. So kindly explain what happened and why did we have all this controversy about the Periodic Labor Force Survey and the way the government collects statistics and collates them? Yes, please.
See, the lesson we learned from the PLFS saga, and not only the PLFS saga, but even the consumption expenditure survey conducted by the NSSO, which was done more or less parallelly with the PLFS, the first PLFS. Both these reports were not released, and the consumption expenditure is still not released. So the lesson we learned from this is that it is very important for any country to keep its statistical machinery as a professional body, which is independent of any government intervention. So no government agency should intervene with the release of statistics produced by an independent professional agency of the government. Like the Reserve Bank of India has got a certain amount of independence, I think the Statistical Commission, the Statistical Office needs to have tremendous independence, and credibility is very important. You get credibility only if you are professional and independent. So I think that is the most important lesson. What has gone wrong? There are many things that have gone wrong. That we have got a higher unemployment rate, and the government of India has tried to see if it could give a counter argument to the picture that the PLFS was showing, that the unemployment rate is very high. So the whole idea of the government was that, look, we have done a lot of work, and all politicians and even bureaucrats will believe that if they've done work, then it has to yield results. But only an independent statistical body can tell you whether actually it is working or not. If the person who is doing the work says, look, I've done a wonderful piece of work, it's not entirely credible. But the government was very keen to give an alternate argument, and therefore it said, look, there are so many mudra loans given out, there is so much registration happening in the EPFO.
That's the employment,
and so
the Employees Provident Fund Organization.
Correct, correct. Thank you, Paranjoy. So the EPFO was showing big increases, and mudra loans were showing big increases as well. And the government was saying that this should lead to employment. But what happens, and I think the lesson to learn over here, and the reason why statistical bodies are very important, is that you can have a big increase in employment in one sector, but it could be at the cost of some other sector. People may have migrated from agriculture, for example, into the organized sector. Very good thing. I think it's a very nice thing to do because agriculture has gotten a larger contingent of labor sitting over there with low productivity. But as we saw in the 1990s, and then the Tendulkar Committee and many others pointed out to us, that the shift, the reason why there was growth without employment is people had moved out of agriculture into industry and services. Not entirely a bad idea, but only an independent statistical body can tell you about this migration. If the government brings in a narrative to show that they have done work, they will only confuse the situation that the statisticians are telling us. So what happened during this time, that when the PLFS came out with its 17-18 estimates of 6.1% unemployment rate, is borne out by its next survey, which still says unemployment is around 6%, and CMI was saying around the same thing. So the government and the entire machinery, the official machinery, needs to recognize that today the avenues of getting data are very many. Not only CMI, which is a big contributor to the discussions in the country, but you have Google searches, you have Google data on mobility, you have lots of other data that tell us that the unemployment rate is indeed very high and the labor participation rate is falling. And in particular, the female labor participation rate is falling very rapidly. If we don't recognize these facts, which are given in the official statistical machinery and in the CMI data, we will not take corrective actions. We'll continue doing the interventions which probably are not working. Like, for example, we were saying mudra loans are doing very well. But now it is time to turn around and ask, can you show us the results of mudra? How many of them are NPAs and how many of them have actually turned out to be useful? I think that data is not coming out, and the banks are not talking about it. They're talking about the other NPAs. So I think it's very important for us to learn a lesson from what has happened in the past, that do not compromise the independence and do not compromise the professionalism that needs to be built into the official statistical machinery.
Okay, thank you so much. Would you like to comment a little bit on a question I asked earlier? The multiple agencies of the government, the Ministry of Labor, the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, bodies like the CSO, the NSSO, is there today need for greater integration of these different agencies? Do they work in tandem or do they work at cross purposes?
So there are two kinds of data to answer this question in the government system. So one is the administrative data, which the EPFO will produce, which the ministries will produce. For example, a very useful piece of data on employment today is the Manrega data. It's an excellent source of data which gives you copious amounts of very useful information. Similarly, the Labor Bureau, through its administrative mechanism, collects a lot of data. So administrative data, as much as collected by the government through their administrative operations, should be released and are valuable.
Okay.
But administrative agencies like the Labor Bureau should not be tasked with conducting surveys. An independent survey like Labour Bureau started to do earlier, which has been now shut, runs counter to the mandate of the Ministry of Statistics. It is the Ministry of Statistics which has got the task of conducting the surveys. We need to strengthen the Ministry of Statistics massively to ensure that they can conduct all the surveys that the country requires, and the line ministries should take care of their ministries and operations, and the administrative data it generates by way of its operations should be made available, but not confused with professional independent statistical agencies like the Ministry of Statistics.
Okay. Let me ask you to talk a little bit on migration. Many argue that what was witnessed in the last days of March, right through April, May, and June, was arguably the biggest internal migration of human beings within a country, within a nation state, ever witnessed in the history of humankind. Now, we'll know whether this is correct or not, but we know that, say, for instance, during the partition of the subcontinent, in the period from around 43, 44, 45, it began and went all the way even after 47 to 48. During this period, it is argued that about roughly 1.5 crore, 15 million individuals were forcibly displaced. But this was largely in two parts of the country, in the northern part, in the Punjab and in Bengal. What we've today seen is a different kind of internal migration, where we've seen many states in eastern India, like Assam, West Bengal, Orissa, Chhattisgarh, Bihar, Jharkhand, where the workers move to different parts of the country. Western Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, Punjab, in the west, in Gujarat, Maharashtra. But this also includes internal migration within states. But the short point I'm asking you, what are your views and what does your data reveal about the scale of internal migration that we have recently witnessed?
So let me first make a small correction in what you said. I don't think we can compare the migration that we saw in March, April to the migration during the partition. The partition migration was characteristically extremely different, totally different from what happened over here. This is an economic migration led by a biological challenge, by an epidemiology challenge, whereas that was a political crisis and was very different, uprooting of people who are well established from their places into new lands. This was migration, people who were not in their homelands going back to their homelands. So very different. I want to look at this migration and learn lessons from here of the importance of migration for any country to grow. India has benefited massively by the opportunities that Indians found in the Gulf. A large number of Indians went out, besides fixing the problem of labor requirements in the Gulf. We have, in the more recent past, found great advantage in our IT engineers going to America or other parts of the country and helping reduce their costs and improve their productivity and bring back remittances home as well. Migration has always been an integral and important part of all development. So I think migration is important. People from the east will move to the west, south, and the north in different ways to meet labor requirements over there. We require labor movement, we require capital movement, we require goods movement to ensure that we can run the country efficiently. What has happened is that we have not recognized the importance of migration. In fact, we have oftentimes turned them to be a source of problem. Bombay, where I resided, where I grew up, has always been unkind during sparks to migrants, whether it was the South Indians or it was the Gujaratis before that, or it is the other cuts of society that you take, but migrants are always getting the rough end of the stick. But migrants are the ones that make the biggest difference, not only in terms of low-level labor, but all kinds of people. A large part of the trading community of Bombay are Gujaratis who came from Gujarat or other parts, and Parsis who came from other parts of the world as well, and also from Gujarat, which built the ethos of the Bombay city, for example. And the same thing goes to a whole lot of service providers in India, in Bombay today. And the same thing holds for many other parts. Many other towns can become prosperous like Bombay if they are more welcoming towards migrants. China has been a major user of the migrants policy. When migrants came into Southeast China, they were provided housing. They may have had other problems, but they were provided proper infrastructure and at least basic living conditions to build Southeast Asia that became the powerhouse, the economic powerhouse of the world. We as a country need to recognize the importance of migrants and not leave them to live in the worst of the slums of the country, of the towns, but give them space and respect.
Okay. Let me also clarify, when I compared what happened during the partition to what has happened now, one should really talk about the scale of displacement of people, not the reasons why people were displaced. Obviously, there were very, very different reasons. So I need to clarify myself, and I completely agree with everything that you've said, that the recent migration has been on economic compulsions, livelihood considerations, whereas what we witnessed in the 40s were largely driven by political consequences, or political circumstances, let me put it this way. Now, I want you to respond to a criticism that is made on the CMI data, and I recently interviewed for SRIRAM's IAS, for the civil servants, aspiring civil servants. I recently interviewed Dr. Pranab Sen. He was the former chief statistician of India, and he also headed the National Statistical Commission, and he had worked for many years with the erstwhile Planning Commission. He said one of the limitations of the CMI data is that you have a fixed sample of households, which, as you rightly pointed out a little while back, it's about 1.75 lakh households, but they are broadly divided into two groups, rural and urban. But after this migration, because that whole equation of who is rural, what was urban has changed, the accuracy of the data of the CMI has come down. This was his criticism. What is your response?
Dr. Pranab Sen, and I have great respect for him, has made this criticism often in the past, and he has even made it to me. And I'll explain like I've explained to him. A, the survey that we are conducting is relatively young. So the sample was created in 2014. Now, if his early criticism was that if you've got a fixed panel, you will not be able to get changes that are happening in the population. Now, what are the changes? Increased urbanization, faster growth in some places, slower growth in some other places. I think these are intergenerational changes. It requires 25 years for this change to be significant enough for it to hit my sample. That's point number one. Point number two, my sample is not as fixed as I would have liked it to be. The sample is actually undergoing a change, and the change is also a part of the design. So partly it is because of compulsions, partly it is because of design. By design, we increase the sample at the rate of 1.5% per year. Now, if we do that, we are obviously refurbishing. Some households are going out, some are coming in at a net rate at which the households is growing in the country. So we have a 1.5% growth per annum on a net basis, which is leading to a larger churn on a gross basis, means many more are getting added and some are getting removed. So I don't think Dr. Sen's concern is serious enough for me to worry right now, but I'd like to make a third point on the same thing that Dr. Sen raises, is that We were waiting, and now there is a fix over here for the 2021 census to arrive, and for us to redraw, reassess the um, uh, the the appropriateness of our sample with respect to the 2021 census data. Now, the 2021 census data itself is getting kind of postponed, it looks like, in which case we will have to think of other means of redoing our sample. But I think Dr. Sen's concern is valid, but only if I keep my sample stable for more than 10 or 15 years. I'm not going to keep it stable for 10 or 15 years for sure. It has been stable with a rate of change of 1.5% per annum only in the last 6 years.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. I want to ask you a few general questions on the state of the economy. You mentioned earlier the data that comes from MNREGA, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Program. Now, after what has happened, the economic recession, some would say we are moving towards a depression. We can discuss and debate how much the economy could shrink or not shrink. But the point is, we need now to generate jobs, to create livelihoods. I want you to talk a little bit about MNREGA, the problems we've had with MNREGA, including delayed payments, including corruption in the implementation, including in the kind of schemes that fall within the ambit of the MNREGA. How can MNREGA be stepped up? And maybe you can also talk a little bit about how we can spend more on the physical infrastructure, the social infrastructure. And if you can also comment a little bit, I know I'm putting a number of questions to you at one go. MNREGA, infrastructure, and what are your views on the universal basic income? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? UBI, as we call it. Yes.
Paranjoy, I'm not a policy prescription person. I don't like to give policy prescriptions, and I prefer to do measurements. I prefer to do analysis. I prefer to explain what is happening, measure what is happening, explain what is happening, and probably give some ideas on what is likely to happen under various scenarios. But to suggest what should be done is the work of a different set of people. And I've been asked this question too often. I have views, but I don't give them as much of weight as I give weightage to my measurement efforts, to my analysis, and to my projections, in a sense.
You're being humble, but nevertheless, let me ask you about the MNREGA. Let's just focus on MNREGA. What does the data reveal about the limitations? And that could perhaps give us some pointers about how to improve the way in which that program is implemented.
So the data tells us that the biggest savior today in this difficult time of the lockdown is MNREGA. So in the month of May, the person days of employment generated under the MNREGA scheme was 56% higher than it was a year ago.
That's a
never in the past.
That's a huge
It's
change.
massive. It's massive. These are person days of employment. This is not some nominal number, not some nominal rupees. These are actual person days of employment generated. 56% high in May. When it reached a record, if you look at the graph of MNREGA person day employment, it is steady like this and it shoots up. It's like a hockey stick going up, reversed. Now, look at what happened in June. 56% increase in May became 99% increase in June.
That's a doubling.
So it's a doubling compared to June last year. So June 19, we had a certain amount of employment in MNREGA, and in June 20, we had 2x of that. Now, July so far shows a 40% increase. And I know that this data undergoes revisions for weeks together. So by the time we reach the end of August, I may not be wrong in conjecturing that July will also have seen something like 60–70% increase in person days employment. And this has never happened since the scheme was launched. So when a crisis came like the lockdown, the government had one instrument in its hand that worked the best, which is MNREGA. So I think it's time for us to learn a lesson from here. At least the data tells us this, that there was no other mechanism available with the government as effective as the Manrega to solve a problem directly into the rural India, into the rural parts of India, to ensure that people do get jobs.
Okay, that's
So,
a very
even if you come up with a scheme, you require to have the processes to be able to implement the scheme. Manrega has the machinery set in place to actually go and intervene and create jobs. So I think this is a great lesson to learn, that in peace times, please do strengthen the machinery, overcome all the problems that you identified, corruption, leakages. Please fix those problems in peacetime, not at this time. At this time, don't worry about corruption. Just go and spend money, because this is the wrong time to fix a leakage. This is the time to just flush the money out. And then in peace times, go and fix all the leakages to ensure next time Manrega delivers even better.
Thank you. That was a very, very important takeaway, that if indeed Manrega and the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Program is the savior, is what is likely to help the Indian economy and the underprivileged sections of India's population, and especially those who live in rural areas the most, this is a very, very important takeaway. Now I'd like you to talk a little bit about what your data shows about what the government is now talking about. The Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliance, self-sufficiency. You could argue that today the government doesn't have a choice. We see an recession, an international recession. We see international trade shrinking. So the question is, whether you like it or not, foreign direct investment, what can come in India or not. Everybody says we should not look at FDI or foreign direct investment, but first develop India, FDI. I mean, the economic survey of 2021 talks about assemble in India and the need for global supply chains. And we've talked about production linked incentives, and we've talked about how particular sectors, say electronics, could generate jobs, which would be labor intensive and not highly automated and capital intensive. So I would ask you to elaborate and give me your thoughts on where you see the government's emphasis on self-reliance and self-sufficiency, how it's showing up, and what does the data reveal, and what are the pointers that we get?
So it's difficult to answer your question with data, but let me try to pull out some data to give some idea of where this government is going with respect to responses to the lockdown and its effects. So the government came out after some delay with some suggestions on what it plans to do to overcome the problems emanating from the lockdown. And there was the plan to spend 10% of GDP, and there was a plan to become Atmanirbhar, and so on and so forth. But the data for the first quarter of the central government tells us that central government spending so far has not increased compared to a year ago. So if there was any implication, and it was not explicit, if there was an implication that the government is going to spend 10% of GDP to revive the economy, that was anyway not the intention, because the spending of the government is very small in that. Any spending by the government to revive the economy is practically zero. And the government is going broke because tax collections are falling. All non-debt revenue generation is down big time.
And the government is told state governments, we can't even give you the GST, the compensation for the goods and services tax.
Correct.
So that's a pretty a very, very alarming situation that we seem to be in at present.
That's right. That's right. So the government is not able to collect taxes sufficiently. It's not able to collect any revenues which are non-debt creating. It's not even creating so much debt because it's not borrowing enough. So we have got a government which is in semi-paralysis insofar as responses by putting money on the table to respond to the current crisis. So now, if we don't put money on this, and if the private sector is not going to do this in these circumstances, I do not know what will pull the economy out of the current morass.
Okay.
And Yeah.
Yeah. But please continue. I'll ask you a question or two after this.
So I'm saying that the government is not spending money, and in this, if it brings in a new thing, which I find as totally out of place where we are, which is this Atmanirbhar thing. I mean, we can talk about being Atmanirbhar in peace times. We can talk of being Atmanirbhar as a strategic long-term goal of India, that we do not want to be too reliant upon foreign capital, upon foreign whatever. And we want to just be inward looking and grow the country through our own internal whatever capabilities we have. But this is not the right time to talk about it. This is the time to say, what are we going to do with this unemployment of 24%? What are we going to do with the labor participation rate falling down, with private sector unwilling to invest? How are we going to ensure that all these problems get fixed up? If the government doesn't get taxes, then how will the government spend for very critical things required in this situation?
Including Manrega.
Yeah, yes. So Atmanirbhar has got its own space, place, time to discuss. I think this is not the time to discuss it.
Okay. Mr. Mahesh Vyas, you've been very, very candid in explaining to the young adults, the civil service aspirants who are with SRIRAM's IAS, that what the government is unable to do is spend more money to get out of essentially a recessionary situation, which is demand driven. I mean, if there was demand, then whether it be the micro, small, and medium enterprises or even the large enterprises, they would be producing more and therefore generating jobs. But what we today have a situation is really a situation of demand recession. And on top of this, we've seen certain states like Uttar Pradesh, like Madhya Pradesh, promulgating ordinances to change labor laws, to allow longer working hours, the terms and conditions of employment. What are your views? Will this work or will this not work?
The objective seems to be to attract investments of a kind that has got scant respect for labor and respect for labor. That's the only thing I can read in this. They wouldn't do it for any other reason. They obviously will be doing it to attract investments, which is a noble thing to do. Attracting investments is a very good thing to do. But if the quality of the labor, of the investments that come in, are all going to be of a nature that takes us back to Dickensian times of extreme exploitation of labor, it will not be a happy country to live.
Okay. I think you made the point very, very, very effectively. Going back to Charles Dickens' England and the slave labor of that time. Anyway, you mentioned one point earlier. I want to take you back there. And you've talked about the impact of the economic slowdown on women. And what you've said, that the data clearly shows that women have been very, very badly hit, badly impacted by the slowdown. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about, in terms of, when you look at it, the data from a gender perspective. What does your data say about the impact of the economic slowdown on women?
So whether it is demonetization or the lockdown, one sees that women during economic shocks leave the labor force. Now, this is in addition to a secular trend, which is also seen in the official statistics, that the female labor participation rate in India is declining over time. A, it is very low, and B, it is declining. I think what is important is for us to A, recognize this. And I think the government does not sufficiently recognize the falling and low female labor participation rate in the country. One problem over here, and I would have liked the official statistical machinery to really look into this and an appeal to the NSSO and all the ex-NSSO, including Dr. Pranav Sen, to go and fix the way you calculate female labor participation rate. It's actually very, very troublesome to think that a woman who has spent only an hour in an entire week doing some work for an house establishment, say you are a dairy milk outfit, a family-run dairy outfit in some rural part of India or semi-urban part of India, and it is the man and the men who are actually hawking the milk and managing the milk business, etc. But the woman spends exactly 1 hour a week, maybe washing the buffaloes. She will be called employed. And for the entire remaining part of the week, she's doing household work, she's taking care of children, she's taking care of people, she's cooking, doing everything else. But because she spent 1 hour washing up the buffaloes in a week, she will be counted as employed. I think that's a travesty.
So, okay.
Now, even that shows female labor participation rate falling down. So females in India are not working. Let's go and find out what is the problem with them. Okay. Urban female labor participation is very low. Is it a problem that they find the workspaces to be extremely insecure? Is it the problem that the transportation from work to home and to work extremely insecure? Has working conditions become extremely difficult for women to work? What Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh have done will ensure women will not go to work very easily. So I think we need to understand why women are not willing to go to work. Begin by first acknowledging the fact that female labor participation is extremely low, and then do more studies to find out why this is the case before we fix it.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very, very important suggestion, how we need to improve the manner in which we are estimating and gathering data on the female labor participation rate. My last question to you, and in a sense, I'd like you to sort of give your concluding remarks as well. We've talked about the migration. We've talked about this huge migration of people. Now, do you see, when do you see the changes happening? It's early days. So in a sense, I'm asking you to look at data that you've already gathered to try and extrapolate what may happen. We do not know really for how long this economic recession will continue. Yes, most people will not be surprised if it continues right through this financial year, but we don't know how long it will continue. We can disagree and debate about whether the economy will shrink by 2% or 5% or 10%. And we can discuss and debate, but that it's shrinking, I think today all but a few starry-eyed government economists are pretty sure about and sanguine about. So I'm asking you to look ahead and analyze what has happened in this period from the last week of March to where we are today as we record this in the first week of August. This has been a tumultuous, a historical, an unprecedented phase in the history of this country and the history of India's economy. Where are we going to move from? When do you see people returning from the villages? When are those jobs going to be created in urban areas? You know, trying to look ahead a little bit, look into your crystal ball, so to say.
Paranjoy, I lost you completely in the last 1 minute. Paranjoy, I lost you completely in the last 1 minute.
Okay, so I'm saying, I repeat what I said. I essentially have been asking you, what does the data show about where we are likely to go? We've seen an unprecedented, a historical disruption in the economy from the last week of March, and we are now in early April. When do we see a reverse migration? How long will the recession continue? How long do you think this will go on? These are some of the, I'm asking you to look ahead, extrapolate on the basis of the information and the data that you've got over the last 4 months and a little longer.
What we have seen so far is that there was a very sharp fall in all parameters, whether you look at labor participation, unemployment, or you look at movement on railways, electricity generation, power, so on and so forth. Everything was seriously down in April. There was a recovery in May, and there's a smaller recovery in June, and an even smaller recovery in July. But we are still significantly lower than what we were before the lockdown. Now, the problem is that some people in the government have started to seeing green shoots. I think they should stop looking at green shoots. They should start seeing that we still have a lot of area to cover, and worry that this recovery is misleading. It is quite possible that we will have shaved off a certain amount of our GDP and work at a lower level for a long time to come. I don't see how a recovery will happen automatically. So what we are seeing now as a recovery, particularly in May and June, is misleading, is the only thing I'd like to warn. I suspect, and I expect, and my projection is that the economy will see more than 6% contraction in 2021. Dr. Pranav Sen actually has a much worse projection for 2021.
He says it could be around 10%.
That's right. And Shankaracharya is also in double digits. So two great economists of the country who have been in the government for a long time are talking of double-digit contraction. I'm talking of about 6% contraction. But either ways, it is even 6% or less than that, this will not get repaired in 1 year unless the government actually intervenes big time towards the objective of repairing the economy. This cannot get repaired by itself.
And this is not the time to look at the fiscal deficit. This is the time for the government to spend. And as the old saying goes, print more notes, ask the RBI to print more currency notes, you know.
That's right. I agree with you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Mahesh Vyas, for giving us your time, for explaining to young adults and those who aspire to be civil servants, those who are with the SRIRAM's IAS, for giving us so much of your time. And ladies and gentlemen, you just heard Mr. Mahesh Vyas. He's Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of CMIE, Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. It's a Mumbai-based organization. He's held that post for 20 years. And we've talked about employment, unemployment, migration, impact on women, and the state of India's economy. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.